Hi guys, welcome back to exmolex. I'm not 100% sure how to describe what I want to talk about today. It's kind of a few things. I guess this is going to be a Lex Rambles video. I want to talk about how the feelings of people who have left the Mormon church are valid. So I guess I'll just tell you what has made me decide I want to talk about this. I have made many videos talking about my experiences in the Mormon church. It's kind of my whole shtick. On TikTok specifically, recently, I guess like past few months, I've made a few videos about my experiences in the Mormon temple. Those videos generally will get a few tens of thousands of views, sometimes a few 100,000. And there's always Mormons that will comment on those videos basically saying, you just didn't understand the temple, and that's why you didn't have a good experience. So with that, I want to talk about how even if you didn't have a good experience in the temple, it's still a valid experience. And I want to talk about that whole idea of understanding the temple and just how that feels from, you know, a Mormon versus ex-Mormon perspective and that kind of a thing. I guess that as this goes on, you'll kind of get like a better idea of what I'm trying to say. One of the comments I got said, "It was your experience. Clearly, you don't understand the gospel or the temple ceremony." And they went on to say that basically if I would humble myself and pray about it, then maybe I would understand better. And like I said, I've talked about my experience going through the temple several times. And within that experience, there were like a whole big wide range of emotions, right? And when I make videos about it, that especially if they're a short form video, I mostly stick to like main points that I can remember. Given this was like 12 years ago, I want to say. Yeah, about 12 years ago that I went through the temple for the first time. And, you know, I don't remember every single little detail because it's been a while. You know, there were times going through the temple for that first time that I felt good about it. There were a few times where I felt kind of scared. There were times where I felt confused. And afterwards, like after it had been a few days, I felt good about it and happy about it. And that kind of just like varied depending on what was going on in my life at the time. But in general, like it was a weird experience, and looking back on it with the knowledge that I have now, it all makes a lot more sense. Like I can look at it and be like, oh yeah, like I didn't know when I went through that the temple ceremony was inspired by Freemasonry, but like now with that knowledge, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Being out of the church has given me a whole different view of what the temple ceremony is like. And so when I tell a story and I talk about what my experiences were like, it's going to be different than it would have been if I had talked about my temple experiences while I was still a member. I've said before a number of times that the first time I ever had the thought that I was in a cult was when I went through the temple ceremony for the first time, because I was very unprepared for what was going to happen, because the temple ceremony is sacred, aka secret, and they don't tell you what's going to happen. So even though I went through the temple prep class, even though I was, you know, reading my scriptures every day, even though I was an active member, all of that stuff, I didn't know what was going to happen till I got there. But I stayed a member of the church for another 5-6 years after that. I went through the temple a bunch of times after that first time. And, you know, once I knew what to expect, it wasn't as bad. Now, if I had talked about my experiences going through the temple while I was still Mormon, I obviously would have tried to play it up to be the best possible version of the experience that I had. I wouldn't talk about the fact that I was scared it was a cult, because I wouldn't want to scare people away from the church. I did mention a few things when I talked to close family members. Obviously, I couldn't go into detail because you're not supposed to talk about what happens in the temple outside of the temple. But like very vaguely, I did tell my family members like, oh yeah, like there were points at which I was a little bit like, ooh, that's kind of strange, you know. But then like we got to the celestial room and I felt really good about it after that. I didn't go into detail about anything that made me uncomfortable. I didn't go into detail about the exact thoughts that I had, or how, you know, I was afraid it was a cult, and then I was afraid that I was going to, you know, God was going to smite me for having that thought in the temple. I didn't talk about how I was confused on how I could even have that thought in this sacred place. And obviously, if I was still a Mormon and I was talking about my experiences now, I would not be able to go into detail about it because you're not supposed to. And I think that that's one of the reasons that so many people aren't aware that a lot of people don't have an overwhelming positive experience when they go through the temple. because you can't talk about it after. And once I had left the church and started talking to other ex-Mormons, and you know, a lot of that was anonymous, because even after we leave the church, we don't feel completely free to speak about our experiences because we don't want to offend Mormons or our family members that are members of the church. And so, but like as I left the church and then started having these conversations, a lot of them anonymously or in private or on like places like r/ex-Mormon, I started realizing I was not the only person who went through the temple and was like really weirded out by it. There are thousands, if not millions, of people who felt confused, uncomfortable, unhappy, or just weirded out in general by the temple ceremony. But those of us who felt that way, majority of us, I'd say probably 98, 99% of us, aren't going to voice that to our Mormon family members. And here's the thing that I feel like a lot of Mormons fail to recognize. Your experience going through the temple is not any more valid than anyone else's just because it was a positive experience. And I know why Mormons would think that, because they believe that the church is true. So obviously, like, a positive experience is more valid than a negative one because the church is true. You can't feel badly about it. But I stayed a member of the church for a number of years after that first temple experience, and I kept going back to the temple, and I would have told people that the temple was a positive, beautiful, happy place. I would have never mentioned any uncomfortable feelings that I had. But like, also, if I had heard somebody say that they had a negative experience, maybe in the back of my mind, I would have been like, oh, like I did too. But out loud, I would have been like, no, the temple is beautiful. What are you talking about? If we think about the validity of people's feelings in general, we could apply it to anywhere. Like the farmer's market. There are some people who go to the farmer's market and have a beautiful, wonderful, happy experience. And there are other people who go to the farmer's market and don't find it enjoyable at all. It's as individual as the people who go there. And you could apply that same logic to anything. Going to visit a foreign country, going to Disney World, going to a concert. There are people who are going to have a good time and there are people who are not. And everybody's experience is valid because that is what they themselves experienced. Everybody's going to have their own experience about what they went through, what their feelings were like, and especially concentrating on that, what your feelings were when you went through or did whatever it is. Everybody's experiences, everybody's feelings are valid. And as somebody who has been on both sides of this Mormon versus ex-Mormon debate, I guess, I can admit happily that some Mormons go through the temple and have a wonderful experience, and those experiences are valid. But some people, like myself, the first time we went through, felt uncomfortable. My experience is valid too. And as far as this whole idea of like, if you went through the temple and you didn't have an exceptional spiritual experience, you just didn't understand it. I take issue with that too. Here's the thing. I grew up in the church, right? I was not a convert. I grew up in it. I was born into it. My whole family, 7 generations back, were members of the church. And I've said this before, but like, I was all in. There were times in my life where I was definitely like more spiritual or more Molly Mormon than other times. But I believed the church was true with all my heart. I read my scriptures. I followed the prophet. I did my very best. And when I messed up, I repented. I felt like I had a connection with God. I felt like I had a connection with Jesus. I felt like I was very ready to go through the temple because I had spent my entire life preparing to go to the temple. From the time I was like little bitty, 3, 4 years old, I knew the song, I love to see the temple, I'm going there someday. I had been there, you know, for baptisms for the dead and for confirmations. I had been on the inside and the outside a number of times. I had toured temples. I thought that they were beautiful places. I had taken the temple prep classes. The members of my family and friends who had been through the temple told me as much as they could without, you know, being sacrilegious. And I felt very comfortable that I was going to have a good experience. And it wasn't that way. So when people say like, oh, you just didn't get it, you just didn't understand, I take issue with that because I feel like I was in a position where there's not much else that could have prepared me more, apart from being allowed to actually know what was going to happen, which you can't. And, you know, I feel like there could be an argument made for some people who go through the temple that are really, really balls deep in the church might not feel uncomfortable or might be able to accept the ceremony wholeheartedly and not have any misgivings about the clothing or the handshakes or whatever, just because they are so deeply embedded into the church that like they're almost brainwashed or indoctrinated and it doesn't weird them out at all. And people like me, maybe I wasn't as deep in it as I thought I was. And so when this weird stuff started happening that didn't feel like the church I was familiar with, it took me aback. I was surprised. And I know that Mormons would argue with that point, but like, I could see a little bit of validity for that theory. I'm curious. I mean, I know that like not everybody who goes to the temple is 100% committed. I think that most of the people who go through are, like for the majority of people, why would you go through the temple if you weren't committed? You know what I mean? But I know that there are some people who go through who aren't all the way in. So if you're one of those people, I would love to hear in the comments what your experience was like. I mean, did you have any sort of misgivings the way I did? The things that had me hesitating the most about the temple ceremony were, one, the clothing. And especially the clothing changes, how we would, you know, have like, okay, here's what happens, pause, everybody change your clothes from one side to the other or whatever. More than that, the handshakes. I was very weirded out that there were secret handshakes required to get into heaven. That didn't feel like the church I knew. The chanting felt very off to me. And the fact that the temple ceremony was 90% a movie. So I'm curious if anybody else had those feelings. I know that other people did, but especially if you went through the temple and you were 100%, actually here, if you went through the temple and you felt 100% committed to the church, let me know if you had a good or bad experience. And if you went through the temple and you were not 100%, let me know if you had a good or a bad experience in general. And again, I kind of want to reiterate, your experience is valid regardless of if it was a positive or a negative one. An actual hallmark or red flag of a cult is that members will try to discredit the experiences and feelings of people who have left. So it's not surprising that many members of the church feel the need to jump in and invalidate the experiences of former members. For those of us who have felt invalidated by members making comments like this, I just want to give you a few reminders. Your experiences with Mormonism are valid, regardless of if they were positive or negative. Your experience is valid even if you're the only one who experienced it. Your experience is valid even if it happened a long time ago or you don't even remember all of it. Your experiences, your trauma is valid even if somebody else tells you that it's not a big deal. Your experiences, your trauma are valid even if it took you a while to realize that it was traumatizing. Your experience is valid even if a Mormon tells you that you just didn't understand. I just want everybody to know that your experiences going through the temple are valid, even if you're Mormon and you still believe. I would love to hear what your opinions are in the comments as long as they're polite. Thank you guys so much for being here. Special thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. You guys are the best. Extra special thank you to Doug Davis for supporting at the Demon tier on my Patreon. Thanks, Doug. If you would like to support the channel, there are links to do so in the description below. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye!